Mr. Marchant is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brill, over the years, various industries have urged the adoption of tax provisions with the stated purpose of incentivizing investment in certain types of energy. In selling the merits of these incentives to Congress, it was indicated that these taxpayer supports would only be required for the amount of time necessary for these industries to mature. To date, very few, if any, of these industries have independently determined that these subsidies are no longer necessary. Could you address the methods and criteria that Congress should use to make its own evaluation as to whether the originally stated objectives of these subsidies has been achieved, and whether what the appropriate means of discontinuing this taxpayer benefit?
Thank you. This goes to one of perhaps the hardest questions for Congress or the private sector to grapple with, which is the rate of technological progress. And so while many will be hopeful that their nascent technology will quickly mature and that cost of productions will fall quickly in such a way that we'll no longer need the government support, these are really hard issues to ultimately predict ahead of time how well those markets will mature. We've seen a lot of policies work their way into the code on exactly that argument. We only need this relief, this encouragement for a limited period of time. Ultimately, the industry can grow to become dependent on these policies, and the economics for any given activity will rely on the availability of a taxpayer subsidy. The ability to wean an industry, and particularly in the energy industry, off of these credits is obviously proving very difficult. I would suggest that to the extent the committee pursues an effort to reduce these credits, you need to think carefully perhaps about a transition, a phase out of some of these policies that might allow the market to understand how things are going to, over time, step down and ultimately end.
So a strategy for an energy source that's heavily reliant on these subsidies, a strategy to come to this committee would be to demonstrate very clearly at what point they feel like they would not need the subsidy anymore, and then codify that and put that into law.
That's exactly right. And if you codified the step down or the phase out of that policy, instead of having them hit a wall where a large benefit goes away overnight, both as a policy matter and I also suggest politically, that might make it more likely that the policy will actually terminate.
And then in the investor community, an investor would look at that and make a decision whether that investment was, in fact, you could tie the risk of the investment to the step down of it, and it might more realistically reflect the investment level might more realistically reflect how actually feasible that industry was.
That's exactly right.
And Mr. White, you mentioned in your written statements that with some tax expenditures, it is difficult or impossible to determine whether a provision is having its intended effect. Should Congress decide to extend a given tax expenditure, what steps should it take to facilitate measuring its impact?
As I said earlier, I think setting goals, assigning responsibility to an executive branch agency for actually doing the evaluations, and I think that ought to be the agencies with functional responsibilities, not IRS. IRS is a tax agency. I don't think they should be in the business of assessing a housing program or an energy program. And then that agency then would make some determinations about the type of data that would be needed to actually conduct the evaluation. So right now, the only data that's collected on many provisions is data that IRS needs for ensuring compliance with the law. IRS is not collecting information suitable for assessing the effectiveness of many provisions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Marchant. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll be very brief. I would like for our committee to also interject another aspect of the extenders and the viability of them, and that is the probability of that program or extender having the same ability to attract investment and the proper amount of investment in a, in fact, reformed tax code, where if I'm at 39% and I'm an investor, I'm looking at deals based on the tax effect on my personal tax return. I'm looking at the income credits, and at that point, the value of all those credits and the value of that investment is worth X. If we follow through, and I believe we will, as a committee, and lower the tax rate, simplify the code, then in 1 year or 2 year, many of the programs that we renew or put back on the books will not have the same level of viability in the investor community because they simply won't have the horsepower to attract the investment that they will at the higher rates. So I would just like to interject that as another criteria when we look at these extenders.
Thank you.
And see if there's some.
Excellent point.
Thank you.
Excellent point.